The first rule of the valley was simple, spoken in whispers and enforced with silence. Don't look there. Everyone knew where there was a stretch of land beyond the old cottonwoods, where the earth dipped unnaturally low and the air always felt colder, even under the same sun that warmed the rest of the ranches. Children were warned away before they learned to read. Outsiders were redirected with nervous smiles, and the men who had lived here longest would turn their heads sharply, as if their eyes themselves might betray them if they lingered too long. But Caleb Harlan kept staring. He stood at the fence line. Every evening, dust clinging to his boots, hands rough from years of honest work, eyes fixed on that forbidden hollow as if it were calling his name. The wind would tug at his jacket, carrying the smell of dry grass and old secrets, and he'd feel the same tight knot in his chest that had followed him for decades. People noticed. They always noticed. And soon, they started talking. Caleb was a rancher, born and raised in this valley, the kind of man people described as solid, not loud, not flashy, just dependable. He fixed broken fences without being asked. He helped neighbors during storms. He never missed a day of work, even when his hand shook from exhaustion. But there was something about him that didn't quite fit anymore. Ever since his wife passed, he'd grown quieter, more distant, as if part of him had been buried with her. The only time his eyes showed any spark at all was when he looked toward that place no one else dared to acknowledge. Years ago, when Caleb was just a boy, he'd asked his father why they couldn't go near the hollow. His father's face had hardened instantly, the warmth draining from his eyes. He'd gripped Caleb's shoulder too tightly and said only, "Some things are better left alone." That night, Caleb overheard hushed arguments, his parents' voices low and urgent. He caught fragments of words that never left him, mystic and same in consequences. From that day on, he learned to obey the rule. He learned to look away until he couldn't anymore. The trouble began the day a storm rolled in without warning. The sky darkened like a bruise spreading across the horizon, and thunder cracked so loud it rattled the windows of every house in the valley. Caleb was out mending a fence when he saw it. A flicker of movement near the hollow, just for a second, something small and unsteady, swallowed again by the rain. His heart slammed against his ribs. Logic told him to stay where he was, to mind his business like everyone else. But something deeper, something older and heavier, pushed him forward. By the time the rain eased, Caleb was standing closer to the forbidden land than he ever had in his life. The grass here was thinner, the soil darker. His boots sank slightly, as if the ground itself was tired. He scanned the area, pulse pounding in his ears. And then he saw her. A young girl, no older than 10, soaked and trembling, clinging to the trunk of a twisted tree. Her eyes were wide with fear, not just of the storm, but of being seen. Caleb froze. This wasn't just breaking an unspoken rule. This was tearing it apart. Everyone knew no one lived there. Everyone insisted it was empty. And yet here she was, very real, very human. When their eyes met, the girl flinched, as if expecting him to yell, or worse. Instead, Caleb slowly took off his jacket and held it out, his hands shaking more than he wanted to admit. That single act set the valley on fire. By the next morning, word had spread faster than the sunrise. Caleb Harlan went there. Caleb Harlan brought someone back. Caleb Harlan didn't listen. People glared at him in the street, their faces twisted with anger and fear. Old friends crossed to the other side of the road to avoid him. At the feed store, conversations died the moment he walked in. No one asked about the girl. No one wanted to know if she was safe. All they cared about was that Caleb had looked. The town council called an emergency meeting that night. The room was packed, the air thick with accusation. Caleb stood alone at the front, shoulders squared, heart heavy. Voices rose, overlapping, sharp with blame. They said he'd endangered everyone. They said he'd reopened wounds that had finally started to scar over. They said some things couldn't be undone, and this was one of them. Caleb listened, jaw clenched, until the noise blurred into a dull roar. Finally, he spoke. Not loudly, not angrily. He told them about the girl, about the fear in her eyes, about the way she'd whispered, "Please don't leave me," when he tried to step away. The room fell silent for a moment, but it didn't last. Someone shouted that it wasn't his problem. Someone else said compassion didn't put food on the table or protect the valley from its past. That's when Caleb understood the truth he'd been circling his whole life. This wasn't about land, or rules, or even fear of what was out there. It was about guilt. Decades ago, long before Caleb took over his ranch, the valley had made a choice. A bad one. Families who didn't fit, who were too poor, too broken, too inconvenient, had been pushed toward the hollow and quietly forgotten. The valley prospered, and no one asked at what cost. Over time, the story changed. The people disappeared. The land became cursed. And don't look there became easier than admitting the truth. The girl's name was Lily. She'd been living in a half-collapsed shack with her grandmother, surviving on scraps and stubborn hope. When the old woman died, Lily stayed, terrified of a world that had already taught her she didn't belong. Caleb couldn't sleep knowing that. He couldn't eat, couldn't work, couldn't pretend anymore. So he did the unthinkable again. He took Lily into his home. The outrage was immediate. Neighbors threatened to report him. Some warned that he was risking everything his family had built. Caleb felt the weight of their anger pressing down on him. But beneath it was something else. Relief. for the first time since his wife died. He felt like he was doing something that mattered. Lily was quiet at first, flinching at raised voices, expecting punishment for small mistakes. Caleb learned patience in a new way, the kind that required softness instead of strength. The valley pushed back harder. Fences were vandalized. Anonymous notes appeared on Caleb's door, telling him to send the girl back where she came from. At night, doubt crept in, whispering that maybe he was selfish, maybe he was wrong. But every morning, when he saw Lily sitting at the table, carefully eating the breakfast he made, he knew he couldn't stop. Change never comes without resistance, and redemption rarely arrives without pain. Slowly, cracks began to form in the valley's certainty. A teacher noticed Lily's sharp mind when Caleb enrolled her in school. A doctor treated her persistent cough and asked questions that couldn't be ignored. Stories surfaced. Other children, other families. The hollow wasn't cursed. It was abandoned, and the people who had sworn never to look were suddenly forced to see. Caleb didn't become a hero overnight. In fact, many still hated him for what he'd done. But something shifted. A neighbor left a basket of food on his porch without a note. Another fixed a broken gate without saying a word. Small acts, heavy with meaning. The valley was remembering something it had buried: responsibility. The final reckoning came a year later, when the council voted to officially reclaim the land and provide help to anyone still living there. It was messy, emotional, painful. Apologies were made too late, but they were made. Caleb stood at the edge of the hollow, watching volunteers clear debris, watching sunlight reach places it never had before. Lily stood beside him, her hand tucked into his, no longer afraid of being seen. Caleb realized then that staring wasn't what enraged everyone. Looking was just the first step. What people couldn't forgive was that he'd refused to look away again. He had lost friends. He had gained purpose. He had learned that doing the right thing doesn't always feel good, and it doesn't always make you popular. Sometimes it just lets you sleep at night. Sometimes it saves a life. Sometimes it changes a whole community, one uncomfortable truth at a time. As the sun dipped behind the hills, casting long shadows across land that no longer felt forbidden, Caleb felt something he hadn't felt in years. Peace. Not because everything was fixed, but because it was finally being faced. And maybe that's the message that matters most. There are places in all our lives we're told not to look. Memories, injustices, people we've decided are someone else's problem. But real change, real healing, begins the moment we stop turning away. If this story moved you, if it reminded you of the power one choice can have, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel, because sometimes the bravest thing you can do is keep staring and then do something that matters.